So I was watching the clock tick, and I decided that I could cut out quite a bit of the teaching by example that I usually do. So I'm going to try to get just right down to the details. The idea is to talk about sources of occurrence data, and then some of the little details of those occurrence data. So for a lot of taxa, but not all, the main source is natural history museums. Essentially, I'm a curator. Full disclosure, I'm a curator of a bird collection at the University of Kansas. But natural history museums are kind of tasked with long-term preservation and accurate identification of life on Earth. And so we do that. That was a set of photos of World Natural History Museums. Not all of them are that ancient, though sometimes it feels like the building where my collection is that ancient. And then there's kind of another world, which is observational data. And it's a far bigger world because in many cases, you can work far faster than specimen collectors can. And then there's kind of a third dimension, which are scientists working and essentially collecting data for a particular study or for a particular purpose, but not necessarily for specimens. So we have lots of data coming in. Obviously, the observational data are mostly about, birds and a few arthropod groups like butterflies, but not all of life. And I just to give you kind of a really brief view of kind of how these data get managed. For a long time, for a lot of my career, things circled around assembling and centralizing databases. So for example, in 1990, two colleagues and I started this project called the Atlas of the Birds of Mexico. It's now been kind of embarrassingly eclipsed by about fourfold more observational data than exists specimens. So we have this beautifully curated database, centralized database of the specimens of Mexican birds in World Natural History collections, 84 museums that we've visited and captured the data from. And now the data resource is not made unimportant, but it is made small by this mass of observational data. And so we kind of get in these complications of, well, what do we do? Okay, which is a good excuse for why after 28 years, we still haven't published the atlas. I read final text copy on an expedition in 2001 when we were stuck in Beijing for a week, and it's still not done. So anyhow, that's the idea of centralized databases. Into the end of the 1990s, what may seem blasé to you guys, but was very, very crucial, was this idea of shifting to distributed databases. And part of this is more of a sociological problem, where you have museum curators like myself and some of you who were very used to believing that the data associated with the specimens that we curate, the data are very, very important and very, very valuable. And so we should do this, right? And protect them against all users. And so one of the things was it was essentially impossible to get people to allow somebody else to serve those data for them. To get a museum curator to allow that data set to be transferred. And so late in the 1990s, several of us worked on essentially this solution where, no, keep your data. The data stay at your institution with you or your successor or your descendants. You don't have to give up anything. You don't have to change a database management platform. And there's some really good science advantages as well. If somebody re-identifies one of those specimens, then the re-identification gets into the database and gets then served correctly to the user. If the data are centralized, that update is harder to do. So there are a lot of reasons why a distributed model was crucial. And so into the 1990s, we started developing these networks, MANIS, HERPNet, REMIB, ORNIS, IDIS, all of these acronyms. A more modern translation of this would look like this. And we'll come back to this at the end of this short talk, and we'll try out a couple of these networks, okay? But let's imagine we get some data in hand. I just want to give a very quick caveat to that. It's so tempting to use, the R package that allows you to type in your scientific name, pull in those data, zing them over to Maxent, right? You forgot one thing, which is data quality, okay? And I had 20 more slides saying, clean your data before you use them, but I'm going to trust that you guys will do that, okay? But I just want to give you one example. It's a fun one. The records in ORNIS that correspond to Mexico, and here are all the different ways that we found that Mexico was misspelled, misportrayed, et cetera, et cetera. So essentially, if we look at the universe of biodiversity kind of out there in the natural world, we can see this big process of leakage of knowledge. And so, obviously, all biodiversity in all places on Earth has not been sampled. But some subset of it has been sampled. Some of those data have been lost. A huge proportion of those data that haven't been lost are not digital, right? They're sitting with some messy handwriting on a yellow old tag, handwriting in India ink. Sometimes it's in old Arabic. Sometimes the handwriting is illegible, et cetera, et cetera. Even of the ones that exist and have been digitized, many of them are not identified or not fully identified. And we can go through all this linkage, but many of those that have been identified are not georeferenced. And so they're hard to plop down on a map. And that's been a major failing of several of the big biodiversity information portals, that this task of georeferencing, which is boring. Right, Mona?
Most exciting research assistantship ever.
Yeah, I think that probably employed Mona for maybe 3 full years. It was a huge portion of her life. I kept expecting her to, go postal on us, but she never did. Maybe I'm not supposed to say that anymore. Anyhow, even once they've been georeferenced, they still need to be cleaned and error checked. And then one of the other big impediments is, are they shared? And so we go through this chain, and we could add all sorts of other leaks. But we go through this chain, and you go from a huge universe of biodiversity to a far smaller universe of biodiversity information that ever existed, down to a pretty small proportion that we're actually able to use in analyses. And to just to give you an idea of this data leakage, look at these pie diagrams. They're for a bunch of bird collections, and they're for a bunch of herbaria. And where you see black, the full information is there and is pretty much immediately usable. Where you see gray, The information exists and could be rescued, could be enabled with some work. Where you see this lighter gray, the information is partial and probably will always be partial. And we defined that always be partial as, does it require going back to the specimen? We decided that was too much work for the biodiversity informatics world. It shouldn't for you guys, okay? But this was kind of a biodiversity informatics analysis. And then where you see white, just that information doesn't exist and will never exist. So my point is, look at information on time, which isn't presently crucial to niche modeling, but will be pretty soon. Information on taxon and place. And then here's the crucial column for niche modeling, which is place and taxon, and then time, place, and taxon. And all I want you to see is that you see circles that are almost all black only for time and taxon, and almost never for place. That's that georeferencing challenge. But what you see is kind of a universal data leakage. And so, look at this niche modeling column. One or two data sources are able to get half or more of their existing data through to usable for you right now. So we're using a tiny proportion of the data that exists and that should be available and current for these analyses. That make sense to everybody?
How detailed does the place data have to be for it to be? If somebody identifies that as that province, is that place, or does it have to be landlocked?
Scale-dependent question, definitely. We defined to get up into this, these top two categories, there had to be county information or better, municipality, because we figured that is often at the grain of the environmental data that we use. State or country, basically we would put that over in the no information category, okay? But to get up into this full information category is very difficult because it requires not just a nice, precise geographic reference, 32.406 degrees north and, 110 degrees, with a nice long decimal west. Not just that, it also has to have the full metadata about precision and uncertainty and sources and datum, and you can see that that's what knocks everything out of the full information category. So we use these coordinates of unknown provenance, of unknown precision, and of unknown accuracy. We should be worried. Okay? Which is another way of saying, take your time, waste a week cleaning your data, throw out 90% of the data points. Okay, we recently published a paper in Proceedings of the Royal Society where we started with 90,000 data points for one species, and we ended up using 160. Okay? Okay, we should talk a little bit more about absence data because Mona promised that I would.
Without giving you the
No, it was on,
24-hour notice.
you didn't do that with the third talk of the day either. Last night at about 9, I was informed about the next talk that I'll give, but it's okay. But we should talk about absence data because it's really important. You're going to be tempted to use absence data, okay? A lot of the statistical approaches that are used for discrimination and classification very generally are things that erect two populations, one yes and one no. Right? And then we've kind of softened that a little bit with this idea of pseudo-absence. Well, what are pseudo-absences? They're places where we haven't detected a presence yet. And we know that no complex natural landscape is universally sampled. So we basically know that some of those pseudo-absences are really undetected presences. Of course, we do have to talk about presence of what, right? Presence of the species or presence of the suitable conditions. Essentially, presence of the niche, which is really the appropriate definition of presence for this, or absence. So we have to be very careful with those pseudo-absences, and we can kind of redefine or restate the contrast that we're going to do. It's between known presences and sites with a lower prior probability of presence. Okay, those pseudo-absences. At least we threw out all the places that include the presences. Our species could still be ubiquitous, in which case the species is present at every one of those pseudo-absences. So you're going to be tempted to use absence data in calibrating models. I looked for the species, didn't find it, or there's no record of that species from this place. And so all of the implementations of GLIMs and GAMs and regression trees and all that stuff, all of those depend on fabricated absence data or absence data that are loaded with assumptions. But you also need the absence data for the thresholding step. You also need the absence data for the model evaluation step. And yet it's the thing that we know the least about. Okay? So let's think about our BAM diagram. I know you're sick of this, but if anybody should be sick of it, I should, right? I've been around it for 13, 14 years. Now, I told you that the presence data are going to be there, right? It's actually not completely true. Where else can my species be present? In the invadable, well, okay, but under current circumstances, where else can my species be? Yeah, in this whole circle, okay? That's essentially the effects of dispersal, okay? Some of those populations are not permanent populations. Some of them are what's been termed the Robinson Crusoe effect. My father was a Defoe scholar, so I'm very particular to that term, but you get dumped off on an island, you live out the rest of your life there, and you die. Okay, Robinson Crusoe hitched a ride back to Britain. So we should bear in mind that we can get false presences that place our species maybe here when that's not within the abiotic suitable area. But our absence data are going to come from a lot of places. Like here, it's not accessible and it's not suitable in abiotic terms. Here, it's suitable in abiotic terms and accessible, but something biotic is missing. Right away, you see the problem. Absence data don't always mean absence of the niche, okay? And in fact, we can have absence data from the invadable region because it's not yet invadable, it's not yet within the M, and we can get absences from within the occupied distributional area because of metapopulation dynamics, because of non-detection. I looked for it, I didn't find it, doesn't mean it wasn't there. Okay, so we've got a lot of complexity in what makes an absence datum. The only meaningful absence data, the only possibly meaningful absence data are those that come from within M. Because everything else is absent at least because it's not accessible. And so it's kind of a meaningless comparison to use those absence data from outside M. The species has never been there, never had a chance to colonize those sites, so we don't know whether it likes those conditions or not. How well do we know the M area? Poorly. When we wrote that paper about M in 2011, all that we were trying to do was to get niche modelers like yourselves to state explicitly why they chose the calibration area that they chose. And just that was a step forward. I think we're now to the point where we state explicitly why we chose our calibration area, and we start to give the reasoning for that in terms of the dispersal abilities of the species and the sampling that generated the points that we're using. But what we really need is it'll probably be simulation based, but something that takes into account dispersal, including rare long range dispersal, that takes into account environmental change, et cetera, et cetera. So 2 of my students now have a simulation where if you read that Barve et al. 2011 paper, we kind of set up a caricature of the simulation that we would want to do. So 2 of my students have now developed that simulation, and we're starting towards essentially you, the user, state some assumptions. Environment constant, how long is my history, environment is not constant, et cetera, et cetera. What's the dispersal kernel? And the idea is that you would then start from some seed, which might be the known occurrence points, but you start from some seed and you do lots of simulations to guess at an M area. We're not there yet. But, so yeah, we don't define this area rigorously at all yet. And then we would need to make sure that we're making our contrasts between, well, ideally, inside this region versus outside it. And you've already seen a couple reasons why we're not doing that contrast particularly rigorously. Okay? Because we have presence points outside of this region, and we have absence points inside of this region. Okay? So, if you have data on absences, do you believe them? Sorry about the it instead of them. A crucial question is it absence of the species or absence of the suitable conditions for the species? How do you distinguish? Well, you definitely need to know M, but we don't do that very well yet. And there are so many sources of noise. My feeling is, sorry, Xiao, I'm going to vote with Mona. My feeling is don't use metrics and approaches that depend on absence data. That would be my suggestion. If you have to, then do everything possible to maximize the probability that those absences are absent. So, I've been in studies where we've done things like, looking at the breeding bird survey data and make sure that the species was present on none of 10 consecutive years of sampling. That starts to convince me at least that it's not an issue of non-detection. Okay? But caveat emptor, right? Let the buyer beware. Don't do it. Don't use absence data lightly. Okay, so just kind of a set of key concepts that we need to think about in terms of characteristics of these records. Well, certainly one issue, and I'm not going to give you all the downstream implications of this, but I just want to get these out in the ether here. One issue is prevalence. You have some study area, you have some M. What proportion of that area is covered by presence data? Is it a tiny proportion or a large proportion? That ends up making quite a bit of difference. Spatial and temporal resolution. Well, for the moment, with our current methodology, we can kind of neglect the temporal resolution. You ought to make sure that the presence data coincide with the environmental data that you're going to use. And given that over your lifetimes, climates have been warming, that may be an issue, right? We blithely use climate data that are either that are averaged over periods that are either prior to 1980, when global climate started to move upward, or we use, and I've never figured this out, the World Clim data, which are 1950 to 2000. And so they're taking the average of something that's not stationary. Okay, I've never really understood that one. So we can kind of neglect the temporal, although we ought to check that we're not using data from 2017 in relation to climates from the mid-20th century, where it may be meaningfully different. But the spatial resolution is pretty crucial. You have those data on the uncertainty and the precision of your georeference. If it's a country centroid for, Algeria, then yeah, it's a pair of coordinates that tell you something about the location of the record, but the uncertainty around it is monstrous. I'll just give you a cautionary tale. The Paris herbarium, 6 million herbarium sheets. They were essentially, last time I visited there, they were in the Stone Age. It was horrible. I would go wash my hands about every 20 minutes, and every 20 minutes my hands would be black from all the dust. It's horrible. So their building was collapsing on them, and so they moved all 6 million specimens out to a warehouse while the building was being fixed. And very intelligently, they set up these really cool conveyor belts and robots to image 6 million specimens in 1 year. Isn't that cool? Right? Love it. I adore them. And those images are pretty much available. I also adore them. And for each image, they very quickly captured a little bit of information. Species name, cabinet, country. Species name, cabinet, country. Species name. And so to make those herbarium sheets available, they put it all out on GBIF. I love it. Except now we have all of these herbarium specimen documented records of plants with coordinates that are not documented with uncertainty measures, but the coordinates are centroids of countries. 6 million of them. And some really rare plants. Oops. Right? So we really have to pay attention to this spatial resolution question. And it's not just a question of how many significant digits. Obviously, if you see coordinate pairs that are integers, you should probably worry. But there are many centroids of countries or, very coarse numbers of minutes, like, 5 degrees, 10 minutes, that give you nice long decimals and look really precise, and they're not. Okay? So you have to pay very close attention to the precision and accuracy of these data, and how you do that will depend on your particular taxon and your particular data sources and your particular methodology. Okay? Geographic extent is going to be in relation to both your taxon and your study and your data resources. So that's one that's a little bit complicated. If georeferencing is needed, talk to Mona. a little bit of nostalgia, but I was just presented with a cardboard box with hundreds of CDs, which were all the locality data that you were using in those georeferencing years. Haven't decided whether to throw it out yet. A big question for niche modeling is those presence data also. Not all of the presences of a species, even though they're real and well documented, not all of them are permanent established populations that are within the fundamental niche. And so we should admit a little bit of error or wiggle where we don't say necessarily that our niche models should include everything, but maybe almost everything. And how big that almost is depends on how facile dispersal is in relation to successful colonization, but also in relation to proportions of errors left in your data. We need to talk about bias in terms of spatial and environmental spaces. We need to remove duplications. We need to consider the sources of error. I've talked about that a bit. We need to talk about absence data, or better yet, not using those absence data. And then just to toss out two last quick points, I'll point you towards a data architecture which has been pretty close to revolutionary in this field, which is called Darwin Core. It was a joke. The bibliographic community, the library community, had the Dublin Core, which they had developed at a meeting in Dublin, Ireland. And it was basically the basic elements of a bibliographic record. It was, authorship and place and time and things like that. And so 1997, I think it was, a bunch of people sat down in the University of Kansas Student Union and developed the first version of the Darwin Core, which was essentially taking the Dublin Core and adding on to it everything you needed to communicate a biodiversity record. So that's kind of a compendium of issues about occurrence data. So first of all, have I forgotten any key concepts? People have questions about any of the concepts?
I have one. So even within G0, you can have sink populations, no? So when you're talking about source and sinks, are you referring to those, or like varograms that could be outside of G0 and are true presence? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I know what you mean. I mean, yeah, we could have, a population that's on the wrong substrate, and we're dealing with climate data. And so population there might not be replacing itself, and therefore it's a sink population. We could have a population that's under some external stress. Ideally, if our niche model is done right, then within the A area, we shouldn't have sink populations. Sink populations in this very coarse heuristic of the BAM diagram would be outside of A but inside of M. Okay? At least those are the most offensive sink populations. Because if you think about it, if they're inside of A and M, then they're not mistuning our models. The problem is when you have a presence datum that's outside of A, so it's in conditions outside of the fundamental niche, but you have a presence of the species there. It could be because the specimen was misidentified. It could be because the geographic coordinates were wrong, or it could be a genuine sink population, right? Those records are what are going to mistune our models because they will be a presence datum under the wrong conditions for the species. Okay? Oh man, it's a universe of incredible amounts of data. Obviously, there are perhaps greater sources of noise, misidentifications and things like that. But I love it. I'm an ornithologist, and to prepare one specimen, start to finish under modern conditions, which is to say tissue and full data and all that, it takes about 40 minutes, and I'm pretty fast. How many observations can you accumulate in 40 minutes? Thousands. So I have this, it's another paper that I'll probably just have them toss in my grave and incinerate with me. But I have this analysis of all digital data about birds on Earth. And the last time I tried to finish this paper, we wrapped up the 2016 data set, which was 400 million records. And so just processing it down to data that I could work with took the experts a month and a half. It's amazing to have that level of data. Birds, we kind of live in this world of superabundance of data, but other groups, citizen science data can be spectacular. Wouldn't it be wonderful to have, people go out to a light by their house and take cell phone pictures of moths at night, right? If those can be identified, then you have a spectacular source of information. So yeah, I love it. Yeah. Other questions?
Are there like different assumptions that you need to make about the movement of, say, a native species versus like an invasive species that's establishing or that's already established, or how do you account for that when the movement?
Okay.
Accessibility.
So if we think about a native species, that species has been present on the landscape for a long time. Okay, let's not talk about how long right yet. It's been present on the landscape, it's been throwing out dispersers kind of out of its dispersal kernel. Some of those fall on places that are suitable, and some of them fall on places that are unsuitable. But it's essentially testing everything that's within its dispersal reach. And so with a native species, you can basically make an assumption of what we could call distributional equilibrium. Doesn't mean that at some point it won't get a super long, well-aimed disperser that gets over that mountain range or over the ocean. Witness cattle egrets with natural colonization of the New World in the 20s, was it? But you essentially get to at least a temporary equilibrium. With an invasive species, you're almost certainly out of equilibrium, which is to say it got here 2 years ago, populations got established, but they're throwing out dispersers, and even if you kind of could characterize that dispersal reach, a lot of those places that are within the dispersal reach and aren't yet recorded as presences, a lot of those places are suitable for the species. So a recently arrived invader is kind of the worst case for niche modeling, because it may well be that everything is suitable for it, even if it only occupies this initial place. So it's tough. And so a lot of what we try to do with invasives, you can't always do this, but we try to take the other distributional areas, not the area that we're interested in, might be other continents, take those as the way of calibrating your model, and then transfer that calibration to the place that you're interested in. Because that assumption of distributional equilibrium is really fatal. Okay? Sure.
So do you think that a lot of the thoughts about niche shift versus like niche conservatism is due to a mischaracterization of that accessibility?
Yep. Is that the shortest answer possible? Yeah. Yeah. I mean, remember what I showed you about that when you ask about equivalency of two fundamental niches, conditioning that on what's available, right? That is the fundamental flaw in 50 or 60 papers that show, niche shift in. And basically, that literature is 98% bullshit. We're among friends here, right?
The politeness went down.
Oh, come on. I didn't say stinking bullshit, right?
Being recorded.
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah.
Oh, anyone has a mic?
Supposed to be on?
Yeah.
Okay. So I use occupancy modeling,
Uh-huh.
which it's supposed to account for false absences. So
Right.
how do you feel about using that kind of absence?
Well, as I said, absences when I've looked for it repeatedly and not found it. If I had a 10% probability of missing it once, then I have a 1% probability of missing it twice, et cetera, et cetera. So I love the concept, but we have to then educate the occupancy data by essentially position in the BAM schema, right? We can get things that are definitely absent that are outside of M. And those are meaningless absences as far as what are the environmental correlates. But no, I love the idea of I looked repeatedly and I'm basically sure of its absence. Now just make sure that that site is a meaningful site.
Right. Which you should probably do anyway, right?
Well, and yet remember, we don't know how to estimate M very well.
That's true.
So it's messy. And, a broader answer to the same question is it's very, very useful to look at a whole battery of M hypotheses. Here's kind of the smallest, and here's the broadest, and do I get the same answer under all of these alternative assumptions? Then I start to believe it. So if we want to save time, I can just put that up and stop.